Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Yuwat. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Rains and strong winds in Gaza adds to misery for displaced families. The Democratic Republic of Congo's government asks the United Nations to allow its peacekeeping mission to help in organizing upcoming national elections. And AI-generated images of African senior citizens walking the runway challenges the typical depictions of elderly Africans. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. Top White House official Jake Sullivan arrived in Israel on Thursday amid a public rift over civilian casualties in Gaza more than 2 months into the Israel-Hamas war. President Joe Biden's national security advisor was greeted by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ahead of talks expected to focus on Israel's military offensive in the Palestinian territory. Ahead of his trip, Sullivan told a Wall Street Journal event he would discuss a timetable to end the war and urge Israeli leaders to move to a different phase from, quote, the kind of high-intensity operations that we see today. In Gaza, strong wind and heavy rain brought even worse misery to displaced families, tearing and flooding flimsy tents, drenching clothes and blankets, and making everyone cold. At a tent camp in Rafah, located on sandy terrain strewn with rubbish, people were trying to recover from a horrible night, carrying buckets of sand to cover puddles inside or just outside their tents and hanging up soggy clothes. Some families have proper tents, but others are making do with tarpaulins, thin see-through plastic made to protect goods, not provide shelter for people. Mohad's white t-shirts with stripes had large wet patches around the collar and on both shoulders.
As you can see, it was torn apart and we tried to fix it. It is torn and water fell on us. We were drenched in rain. We tried as much as we could to protect ourselves so water does not get through, but rain got in. This was to protect people sleeping under it. But cellophane does not protect people sleeping under it.
Rafah, next to the border with Egypt, is the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip, where people have been arriving in growing numbers to seek refuge from intense fighting between Israel and Hamas, now raging in both the north and the south. Meanwhile, residents of Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza could be seen wandering through the streets of the town on Wednesday, where not a single house seemed to have survived heavy bombardment and fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas. Most of the population moved south, but some came back to inspect the damages and salvage whatever they could from the ruins. The Jabalia refugee camp in the north of Hamas-ruled Gaza was among the sites that suffered the most from intensive fighting and airstrikes. Israel's offensive in Gaza following the October 7th attack by Hamas has internally displaced 85% of the Palestinian enclave's 2.3 million population. The Biden administration's support of Israel in the war against Hamas has drawn sharp criticism, both from Americans protesting Palestinian civilian deaths and from State Department staff calling for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden has been signaling to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he needs to change course or risk Israel's international standing. VOA senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
For decades, the United States has sought to mediate the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians over land, control of religious sites, and sovereignty. In 1993, a promising moment at the White House when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization negotiator Mahmoud Abbas signed a declaration on self-government, commonly referred to as the Oslo Accords. Peace appeared close at hand, but the Palestinians ended up violating the agreement, according to former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense Lawrence Korb, who witnessed the signing. Korb, now a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress, tells VOA he still believes in a two-state solution, but under a new Palestinian leadership.
Now, the Palestinians got to get their act together. You know, their leader, Mahmoud Abbas, he's out of it. He's too old. He can't, be effective. They have to get another leader, too. And if you can get a separate Palestinian state out of this horrible situation, that will be really a significant achievement and will make it much easier to maintain stability in the region.
Aaron David Miller worked for Republican and Democratic administrations for decades, often as part of the U.S. team trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East. He sees more continuity than change in U.S.-Israeli relations, especially with President Joe Biden in the White House.
For Joe Biden, alone among modern American presidents, he considers himself literally part of the Israeli story. His relationship with Israeli prime ministers and other leaders goes back decades. I mean, he insisted on going into a war zone when this crisis first broke.
Biden embraced Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just days after members of the U.S.-designated terrorist group Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis and took more than 200 others hostage in the brutal October 7th attack. He has repeatedly said the United States will always be there for Israel. But in 2 months, Israel has pounded the Hamas-run Gaza Strip, displacing at least 2 million Palestinians, wounding more than 50,000 people, and killing thousands more in the bloodiest campaign in the decades-long conflict. Biden recently told an audience of political donors that Israel is losing support from other countries because of its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and that Netanyahu should change his hardline government. In New York and other cities, thousands of Americans have taken to the streets to protest the killing of Palestinian civilians in Israel's offensive against Hamas. Some White House and State Department staff also have strong feelings about the conflict, with some signing letters of protest and even resigning from the administration.
People on the inside of the State Department have been watching our policy towards Israel, for many years, for decades in some case. And we've largely had unconditional military support for Israel. So there's an understanding on the inside that we have not used tools that we have available, using the leverage that we have with our military support to press Israel to do more to address the Palestinian issue.
And while many have demonstrated against Israel's offensive, thousands of Americans also turned out in Washington in mid-November to support Israel and condemn anti-Semitism. Cindy Sain, VOA News, the State Department.
Tanzania's foreign ministry on Thursday confirmed the death of one of its nationals who was killed immediately after being captured by Hamas during the October 7th attacks in southern Israel. The Israeli government had named 2 students from Tanzania, 22-year-old Clemens Felix Mtenga and 21-year-old Joshua Loitu Molel, among those missing since the attack. Tanzania's foreign ministry announced Mtenga's death last month without elaborating on how he was killed. On Thursday, Foreign Minister January Makamba said authorities had been informed by the Israeli government that Joshua Molel, a young Tanzanian who was studying in Israel and with whom they lost contact since October 7th, was killed immediately after being captured by Hamas. In less than a week, the Democratic Republic of Congo will conduct its presidential elections. The government in Kinshasa has asked the United Nations to allow its peacekeeping mission to help with the logistics of organizing the polls, according to a letter seen by Reuters. There have been challenges in the distribution of voting materials due to a lack of paved roads and conflict in rebel-plagued eastern provinces, where a UN peacekeeping mission is deployed. For more on the challenges faced by the presidential candidates as well as voters, Anastasie Tudiesh has this report from Kinshasa.
I'm here on Boulevard du 30 Juin, and the building I am showing you is the CENIS, the Congolese National Electoral Commission, where the name of DRC's next president should be announced in a few days. Campaign trails in DRC are quite the challenge. Within 30 days, the candidates, this time 26, are supposed to visit all 26 provinces some of them being the size of Gabon. With the insecurity in the Kivus and Ituri, among other areas, the poor logistics, not enough planes, most of the roads broken, it takes excellent health, dedicated teams, and lots of resources to be a presidential candidate here. However, the fever, the faith, the trust voters show their candidates is impressive. Last but not least, DRC being the kingdom of music that it is, each candidate has its own soundtrack and the matching dance. So 26 candidates are registered, but 4 stand out. The incumbent president, Felix Tshisekedi Chilombo, 60, who asks his voters for 5 more years to, and I quote him, consolidate his achievement. Second candidate that stands out, millionaire, some say billionaire, Moise Katumbi, 59, former governor of the mining province of Katanga, who promises to manage the country the way he does his businesses, successfully. Mr. Katumbi is biracial, and his identity is the target of more or less veiled attacks. 4 candidates have already dropped out to join forces with him. Martin Fayulu, a former oil executive who to this day claims he has won the 2018 elections, Mr. Fayulu's campaign tagline is, "Now is the moment." And the newest to the political scene, world-renowned gynecologist surgeon Denis Mukwege, 68. His promise, fix and heal the Congo. Not one, but 3 main issues are discussed during this campaign: the economy, the insecurity, and youth education. One thing Congolese people are obsessed with is unemployment. Everyone I have spoken with while on the campaign trail has shared their hope for their candidate to bring them good jobs. Now, do people trust the election process? Some do, some don't. Like this group of Congolese civil society activists who have launched Capita, a self-financed election observation mission in Kinshasa. They say they fear frauds and want to monitor the votes on election day by asking volunteers to take pictures of the results posted at polling stations and centralize them in an application. Other voices say the elections are unlikely to happen, citing the size of the country and the Electoral Commission logistic issues. One thing is for certain as we speak, the electoral campaign here in DRC is still going strong. Anastasie Tudièche for VOA News, Kinshasa.
South Africa's president on Wednesday sought to ease tensions between rival members of the Zulu royal family after a court ruled that the state's recognition of King Misuzulu Zulu was unlawful. President Cyril Ramaphosa's office said he will appeal Monday's Pretoria High Court ruling that his move to recognize Misuzulu Zulu at an elaborate ceremony in October 2022 was unlawful. The king's older brother, Prince Simakade, sought the ruling. The 49-year-old king had faced other challenges after being nominated to take over from his father, King Goodwill Zwelithini, who died in 2021 after ruling for 52 years. Ramaphosa's office said Misuzulu Zulu would remain monarch for the more than 10 million Zulu people while the appeal is launched. Nearly 200 countries have signed up to a deal to shift away from fossil fuels at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai. The summit's president called it a historic agreement, but not all nations are satisfied. Henry Ridgwell reports.
A deal in the desert that proponents say heralds the end of the age of oil. All 198 nations present at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai signed up to the final deal. For the first time, the agreement calls on all countries to transition away from fossil fuels, the main driver of climate change.
It is a plan that is led by the science. It is a balanced plan that tackles emissions, bridges the gap on adaptation, reimagines global finance, and delivers on loss and damage.
Many delegates welcomed the agreement after 2 weeks of hard-fought negotiations.
Everybody here should be pleased that in a world of Ukraine and the Middle East war and all the other challenges of a planet that is foundering, this is a moment where multilateralism has actually come together and people have taken individual interests and attempted to define the common good.
More than 100 countries had lobbied for stronger language to fully phase out fossil fuels. But oil-producing states, led by Saudi Arabia, argued that the world can slash emissions without shunning specific fuels. That prompted criticism from some delegates, including the most vulnerable island nations.
We have made an incremental advancement over business as usual, when what we really needed is an exponential step change in our actions and support.
On the one hand, this is a good sign and signal that the world is finally dealing with fossil fuels after almost 3 decades of refusing to deal with it. But on the other hand, the new text includes cavernous loopholes that will allow for the oil and gas industry to continue.
That includes the use of so-called carbon capture technology, which removes some carbon dioxide emissions.
The energy transition to renewables is far more feasible than trying to capture carbon from the atmosphere. We know what we need to do, and governments now need to find ways that work for them economically and politically to commit to that and then deliver it. And that needs to happen very fast.
Scientists say we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 43% in just 6 years to meet the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It remains to be seen whether this COP28 deal marks a turning point or another missed opportunity. Henry Ridgewell, VOA News, London.
The Chinese embassy in Kenya is looking to boost cultural ties with the Kenyan public through festivals such as food extravaganzas in Nairobi. Analysts say it is a way to forge stronger connections at a time when Kenya's president is asking China for more loans amid public criticism that Kenya already owes China too much. Victoria Munga reports from Nairobi.
At a hotel in Nairobi, Kenya's capital, dozens of people gather to watch this display of Chinese culture. This performance ushers in a food festival sponsored by the Chinese embassy and hosted by Kenya's China Teachers Association. President of Sync International Education, Michelle Chang, says their goal is to promote Chinese culture and keep the relationship between Kenya and China strong.
This year, 2023, is the 60th anniversary of Kenya and China diplomatic relationships set up. So I think we should keep in touch more and more and closer and to become like good diplomatic relations within both countries.
Forging stronger ties through cultural events can also bridge language differences, says economist Eric Musau.
European countries generally have always had very strong ties, looking at the Commonwealth or America, the common language is always a big positive between Kenya and most of Europe as well as America. And so for the Chinese, there's that gap, especially around the language barrier. They've been trying to encourage more Kenyans to study the language.
Chinese presence in Kenya has been growing over the years. Chinese companies have built massive projects in Kenya, like the standard gauge railway between Nairobi and Mombasa. At the same time, Kenya's central bank says the trade deficit between Nairobi and Beijing grew to $3.62 billion in 2022, up from $3.51 billion the previous year. Musau says the infrastructure is beneficial for Kenya, but the trade disparity is a challenge for diplomatic relations.
In terms of exports to their market, you're looking at just a couple of $100 million. So the balance of trade is really in their favor. And when you look at the structure of the economies and where, for example, Kenya wants to go, it's very unlikely that you'll ever have a very good overlap in terms of a balance of trade compared to, let's say, America, where exports and imports are almost on balance.
Balance is something that Steve Wakoli says he was missing in his life before he learned the Chinese language and martial arts like Kung Fu. He now makes his living teaching Chinese and performing martial arts.
I started receiving invitations from companies for performances. I went to schools like Chinese Confucius schools. I went to Kenyatta University, went to Nairobi universities for performance.
But Wakoli is an exception. Many Kenyans are uneasy by what they say is too much Chinese engagement in Kenya, especially in the retail sector.
We used to buy clothes from China, but now they have their own store here, and what they sell is cheap. Our customers all go to their store to find cheap products.
Because of the infrastructure projects, Kenya's debt to China stood at $6.3 billion as of March 2023, almost 2/3 of the country's total bilateral external debt. Analysts say cultural programs such as this food festival aims to ease uncertainty caused by what some Kenyans see as unbalanced economic relationship. Victoria Amunga, VOA News, Nairobi.
Still to come, images of elderly Africans walking the runway create a buzz that goes viral. Stay tuned.
Experts say cultural expectation and individual aspiration are often the source of tensions and frustration between parents and children in the diaspora, particularly with girls. This week on Our Voices, we'll hear young African women talk about their quest to education and career achievements in the West while trying to fulfill their parents' wish to preserve family heritage, culture, and religion. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, a Senegalese judge on Thursday ordered that jailed opposition leader Ousmane Sonko be reinstated on the electoral roll, clearing the way for him to stand in next year's presidential election. Sonko was struck off Senegal's electoral roll after being sentenced in June to 2 years imprisonment for morally corrupting a young person. He has been at the center of a standoff with the state that has lasted more than 2 years and sparked several episodes of deadly unrest. Chadians vote on Sunday on a new constitution in a key step towards elections promised but postponed by the ruling junta and seen as a test of legitimacy for the Deby dynasty's more than 30-year rule. Transitional President General Mahamat Idriss Deby Itno, whose junta has governed since 2021, has promised to hand over to civilians and hold elections this year before postponing them to 2024. And the United States said Wednesday that it was ready to resume cooperation with Niger on the condition its military regime commits to a rapid transition to civilian rule. Washington suspended aid to the jihadist-hit West African country following the July 26 coup that toppled the country's elected president, Mohamed Bazoum. Images of African senior citizens walking the runway created a buzz on social media, eventually going viral. These AI-generated pictures challenge the typical depictions of elderly Africans, showcasing them in an empowering way. Karina Chondri has the story.
Bold, stylish, futuristic, ageless, and generated by artificial intelligence. Malik Afegbua's series of images showing African senior citizens walking the runway in fashionable clothing went viral on social media late last year. The filmmaker and visual artist based in Lagos, Nigeria, calls this work Fashion Show for the Elders, part of a larger collection of his digital artwork called the Elders series. He says he aspires to portray African senior citizens in a way that is rarely seen.
The Elder series is about showing the elder society in a place that is not marginalized, in a place that is spoken for in pop culture, fashion, and other industries that we don't normally see them.
The series is personal for Malik. After his mother was put on life support due to a double stroke, he turned to the arts for stress relief and creative expression.
I was very close to my mother. There was a point where I couldn't speak to her anymore. Last year, I felt like, because it was helping me to go through what I was going through, let me just share this with the world, and we're here today.
The Elders series unlocked new opportunities for Malik that once seemed unimaginable. He studied business at the University of Surrey in the UK, and his first business was designing and selling t-shirts. Now he is collaborating with designers at Marvel Studios. Ruth E. Carter, the Oscar-winning costume designer for the movie Black Panther, was one of the many people who reached out to Malik.
We have worked on something already where we created the art direction of some sort and the costume for the main actor, which is for Blade.
The rise of artificial intelligence has raised ethical questions, with some arguing that it undermines human-created art. However, Malik sees value in using AI as a tool.
You cannot create what I created with AI because you don't even know how I did it. And that's because I created it with my own data sets as a tool, and that wasn't the only tool I used. For African visual artists, they need to experiment and do a lot of research about it because at the end of the day, it's just a tool.
In the heart of Amsterdam, a celebration is brewing.
During Africa Fashion Week Amsterdam 2023, Malik brought his digital fashion show to life.
The crowd will go wild, man!
Linda Fashkin, owner of the clothing company Cocaine, or CKG, was one of the designers Malik invited to collaborate with on the fashion show. She said Malik's designs are empowering.
When we think runway fashion, we imagine 20-somethings and teenagers, but we have to remember something. That the elderly, they still want to feel sexy, they want to be vibrant.
For Oluwakayode Eti, creative director of Skentile by Eti, it was a personal connection to Malik's work that compelled him to join the team.
About a year before, I had a show and I had my mom walk the runway. The first thing when I saw Malik's AI, I was like, wow, I can see my mom all over again. I can imagine some other mothers doing this, living their dreams.
Malik feels that African history and culture is often misrepresented. This fashion show is a way of showing the continent in a different light.
If you come to Africa, we're flourishing. So that's me doing things to alter the perception of the fact that we're not slaves, we're elegant, we are not the ethnic minority, we're ethnic, and we're royalty.
Malik plans to bring his fashion show for the elders to a runway in Nigeria in early 2024. This time not with professional models, but with everyday mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, and grandparents, creating fashion to celebrate them. Karina Chaudhry, VOA News.
Thanks, Karina. Thanks, viewers.